The title of my piece is Okinawa, the Hawaii of Japan. And to talk about how I became interested in Okinawa, we need to talk a little bit about the time that I spent in Japan. I worked teaching English at a YMCA in Kitami, Hokkaido, which I don't know if the clicker is working, so we're going to do that. That is way up north there. That is up by the Okhotsk Sea, which has the southernmost sea ice in the world. It's very, very cold, and very much weather-like from northern Wisconsin. I'm from Wisconsin. If you're from that part of the world, you know like how much snow it gets up there. Kitami was very much like that. However, while I was teaching there at a YMCA up in Kitami, my cousin and her husband had been ROTC in college and was serving out the rest of his kind of term for that as a doctor in Okinawa. Okinawa is way down there. It is at the bottom of Japan, like the southernmost part of Japan, in what are called the Ryukyu Islands. And so when I was kind of looking at trips to take over a spring break, I thought, you know what, I've got family down there, so I can go by myself and I don't have to worry about meeting up with people, and my Japanese is pretty good. So I'm gonna go to Okinawa. And you have to understand, this was mid-March. This is what it looked like in Hokkaido in mid-March. If you can see the snow there. By the way, most of the photographs in this are taken by me. If they're not, most of them I have credited. Versus what it looked like in Okinawa. So there was a reason I wanted to go there. Okinawa is part of the Ryukyu Islands. It's a chain of islands running from Taiwan to up here. And I'm gonna just shout. Southernmost island of Japan, which is Kyushu, up there, the mainland part of Japan. And the Ryukyu Islands are, they're kind of volcanic islands. There's a subduction plate going under the Pacific. The Pacific's going under there. They're not as volcanic as Hawaii, but they are an island chain in the south and about the same latitude, a very similar climate. If you look at them, you'll see that they both have the coral reefs. I did not take that picture of Hawaii. That's from Flickr. But the one from Okinawa is mine. They've got beaches. It's a tropical climate. I was asked why I was going there in March because it wasn't swimming weather, and it was like, I don't swim. So, like, literally I can't. So I'm going to the UNESCO sites. That's what I'm there for. That's the kind of person I am. Very similar, gorgeous climate. It's got very much kind of its own unique culture. I've got over here, I misspelled it, but Hawaiian tiki and an Okinawan shiso, which were everywhere. These kind of, they're modeled after Chinese guardian lions, but they're very distinctively Okinawan the way they do them. So there is a lot of parallels between Hawaii and Okinawa. They're both these tropical islands connected to a larger country. They're big vacation spots with kind of an exotic culture. And I'm not the first person to have made this kind of connection. For example, when Lilo and Stitch was made in 2002 and was set in Hawaii, where it featured a little alien space landing and crashing there, learning about the culture of Hawaii, that movie was extremely popular in Japan. I did not know until I went over there how huge Lilo and Stitch was in Japan. So of course they made an anime of it, and the anime is set in Okinawa. And specifically is set in an island in the Ryukyus, an imaginary island in the Ryukyus right off of Okinawa. And as you're going to be able to tell, yes, karate actually, is a part of Okinawan culture. So there he is learning about Okinawan culture. My understanding is that, I've never actually seen the movie, confession time, but my understanding is fans of this movie in America hate this anime because in it, Lilo grew up and became a teenager and didn't play with Stitch anymore, so he goes flying off to Okinawa. And so they really hated this girl. I don't know. It seems Disney adults are weird. Anyways. But now you're thinking right now, maybe you're thinking, okay, so I've just described this wonderful, kind of exotic island place. You're thinking, well, you know what, I'm a sophisticated, educated person. I've seen the White Lotus. I know that there is behind Hawaii a really ugly history of colonization and exploitation and being kept in poverty to a tourism industry. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, is this going to be a depressing nerd talk where I tell you that that's true for Okinawa? Yeah, yes. In some ways, it's not as bad. In some ways, it's not as bad as what happened in Hawaii. We didn't, completely replace huge portions of the population with immigrants to work on plantations run by a pineapple company, but there are other ways in which it's worse. So I'm going to try to end on a light note, but we're going to be talking about some serious stuff with this. Anyways, Okinawa has a really long history. During the Ice Age, most of Japan was covered by an ice cap. So a lot of the earliest fossil records that they actually have of people are in the Ryukyu Islands in the south. Here's one that I saw at our presentation. This was one of the more complete skeletons that was found there, and it goes back 18,000 years. They have found some remains going back 30-some thousand years in Okinawa. So very old, long time inhabited, but not really by Japanese people per se, not the way we would think of Japanese people. Like the earliest finds, they were doing a lot of fishing. Later on, there was taro farming and pigs, which is very typical of Austronesian cultures. If you remember, the Ryukyu Islands are really close to Taiwan. That's where Austronesian cultures like you find in Southeast Asia and the Pacific originally came from. And we don't know for sure whether the original Okinawans spoke Austronesian languages, but we know that they definitely had interaction with those people and had gotten some technology and things from them. But as around somewhere between about 2,000 to 1,500 years ago, culture from the 4 big islands of Japan starts seeping down into the Ryukyu Islands archipelago. Rice culture. This is when you first start seeing people actually cultivating big rice fields, and also where you start introducing Japonic languages. Now, you may have been told that Japanese is a language isolate. No. There are about half a dozen languages spoken in the Ryukyu Islands that are related to Japanese. Officially, they are listed as dialects of Japanese. They're mutually unintelligible. You cannot understand them. I've heard them on TV. It's as different as French and Spanish. They're different. They are very obviously connected to each other, but they're separated. And so the rice culture came in, and the people who brought the rice culture into the area were speaking Japanese, and that language was picked up. There's no evidence of an invasion or people being wiped out. It was just the culture spread through. And I'm going to give you a little demonstration of how closely Okinawan is related to Japanese. I don't know some of the other smaller languages spoken in the Ryukyus. Okinawan is probably the only one that has a chance of surviving. We're going to talk about why that happened later. But I'm going to do a little comparison here. So if Japanese, the word for star is hoshi, the word in Okinawan is hushi. One of the rules is if you have a, I, u, e, o in Japanese, it's a, I, u, e, u, except it's a little more complicated than that because when Japanese and Okinawan split off from each other, there were actually 7 vowels in Japanese, but so the rules change a little bit for that. But hayaku, quickly, is hueku in Okinawan. Asobu, to play or to have a good time, is ashibi. You can kind of see how they're related, and that there's changing some going. But then some of them get, not quite there yet. Mori, which we'll see later, which means forest or a grove of trees, is mui. But then you have some that are a little bit harder to tell, like utsukushi means beautiful in contemporary contemporary Japanese. It's churasa in Okinawan, which is wildly different. But that's because the Okinawan word comes from a Japanese word, kyorasa, which actually in contemporary Japanese means pure or clean, but had a connotation of beautiful back 1,500 years ago. So, and then you have some that just we're not entirely sure the etymology of. The word for castle or fortress in Japanese is shiro, and it's gushiku in Okinawan, which is obviously wildly different. They think the gu might be an honorific. I don't know. There's some debate about where it comes from. But that does lead us into our next discussion. Gushiku is usually pronounced gusku in actual Japanese, and they're the hill forts. So between about 1000 and 1300 AD, you start seeing all of these hill forts emerging all across the island of Okinawa and in a few of the other islands in the Ryukyus. And these were kind of the first little kind of city-states that people built themselves out of. And they're all UNESCO sites. You can do big tours of them around. So you start seeing the formation of little city-states, And then in 1439, a guy named Shohashi united all the islands into one Ryukyu kingdom. And his lineage would go on for the next 400 some years, controlling all of the islands between Taiwan and Kyushu. And this is the capital of Naha. This is a model from the Shuri Palace there. I'm gonna pop over here. At the top here, this is the old hill fort that it was built out of. Became a big, giant palace complex that I'll be showing on the next slide. And the capital, current capital of Naha, of the prefecture of Okinawa, was the capital of the Ryukyu kingdoms. So this is a separate kingdom from Japan. Japan is doing its thing with the shoguns and everything, and that is separate from the Ryukyus during this time period. And their biggest cultural influence at this time is actually China. They had a lot of interaction with China. The song that I had them playing during the intermediate there is a traditional song that you would sing to welcome the emissaries from China to Okinawa. That was who they had their primary tribute relationship with, was China. And you can see that in the design of the Palace of the Kings, a Shuri Palace, Shurijo in Japanese, Suimuikan in Okinawan. And this, I loved this royal garden that I went to, Shikinaen or Shikinaudon in Okinawan. But you can obviously see it's very strong Chinese influence that they had on their culture there. And I just like sharing this one. So this, in Shichinan, there is a spot where you can go up to, and they have the trees and everything thing positioned so that this is what you see looking out through it. And you might notice what you can't see looking out here over at Okinawa is the ocean. This is one of the few spots in Okinawa where you stand that you can't actually see the sea because it's a fairly skinny little island. Apparently this is where they would take emissaries from China to show them to make Okinawa look bigger than it actually was, to try to impress them. So I enjoyed that. All right, but in spite of the influence from China, they did keep their own unique culture. This is another site that I went to, the royal tombs, Tamaudon. And interestingly, as we'll get to, these are one of the few sites that I'm showing that are not reconstructions. These survived the bombings during the Battle of Okinawa. They're huge stone mausoleums. Some of the roof was damaged, but for the most part, the buildings remained intact. This is where they would bury the king and his family. And you can see that there are 3 doors there. One door goes to where they would bury the kings, one door would go to where they would bury his family, and the other is where they processed the corpses. Because the rest of Japan adopted Buddhism and got into cremation. You cremated people, and that's just the way that you do things in Japan. Buddhism, there were temples. There were some, people, especially in the upper classes, were Buddhist, but it never really permeated into the culture. So they still had traditional burials where you would bury people in a tomb, let the tropical weather do its work for a little while, and then you would scrape the flesh off the bones and reinter the bones in a jar. And so you had one tomb that you would put the bodies in and let that happen, and you would do the cleaning out there, and then they would be permanently stored in one of the adjacent tombs, either for the king or for the family. So. Traditional Okinawan religion, like I said, they didn't really become Buddhist. The name of Shuri Castle in Okinawan, Suimuikan, is the palace of the grove of Shuri. And this is actually the sacred grove that they had in the center of the castle compounds. It was largely run by women, and still is to a certain extent. There still is a fair bit of practice of Okinawan religion. Not that you would guess by polling that they do in Japan, because they poll people on religion in Okinawa, and it's like everybody says none, but that's because they don't list Okinawan religion as an option. So, they're not Shinto, they're not Buddhist, they're not Christian, they're this. And it's, it is kind of a more, I hate using the word animist oriented, but it's much more like local spirits and local sort of things. And yeah, it's largely had traditionally been a largely women-run religion. And they also have their own food and music. This is what I ate at the restaurant. Their champuru is just like a kind of stir-fry dish. Very good. If any of you know Samurai Champloo, the anime, that's where the champuru comes from. But next to it is mimiga, pig ears. They're very rubbery. I could not finish them. But pigs are a huge part of the traditional diet in Okinawa. And the woman here was a woman I ran into on the street who was playing the sanshin, which is a traditional 3-stringed instrument, adapted from some of the ones that they had in China, but they use like a shark skin on the back to give it that really twangy sound that you could hear in the music that I had playing there. And they kept a lot of their traditional Okinawan names. And so if you see people with the names in parentheses in Japanese, there's a good chance they might actually be Okinawan. That's the Okinawan pronunciation of their names. So like Higa is Huija, Kinjo is Kanagushiku, Shimabukuro is Shimabuku, Tamagi is Tamagushiku, and Miyagi is Nagushiku. Now, if you recognize the name Miyagi, yeah, there's a reason they gave him that name. Pat Morita is not Okinawan, but his character is, and karate is one of the big things of traditional Okinawan culture. And if anybody ever gets like snobby and says, it's karate, tell them in Okinawan it's karate. It's actually pronounced T at the end. And it didn't actually originally mean empty hand, it meant hand from the Tang period because that's China. It was adapted from Kung Fu. So, all right. So, enough of the kind of happy stuff. In the 17th century, Okinawa had previously had kind of an on and off tributary relationship with Japan. Like they would send, every once in a while, they would send gifts to the neighbors in the north. That's partly because during this whole time period, Japan was a giant mess. If you know your history from that time period, it was often racked by civil wars and people having conflicts with each other, samurai hacking each other to bits, right? Then it got unified in the 17th century under the Tokugawa shoguns. And one of his the Tokugawa's clans down in Satsuma basically decided that the kings of Ryukyu were not doing enough to acknowledge the Tokugawa shoguns, so they got permission to invade, which they did. And Japan is just a much larger country than the Ryukyu Islands, and so they were able to do a lot of damage. They kidnapped the king at the time, Shonei, and took him captive to Edo, modern-day Tokyo. He was eventually released, and what they had at that point was this, two things happened. The Shimazu clan from Satsuma, which is in Kyushu, got control of the northernmost Ryukyu Islands, the Amami Islands. So they were technically, those were no longer part of the Ryukyu Islands, they were technically part of the Satsuma Han, or feudal domain. And then they also now had this very strictly controlled tributary relationship with Japan. They were sending tribute on a regular basis, they had restrictions with doing trade with other countries. They were still technically independent. They had their own king and kind of in their own internal affairs. They were still free, but like a lot of their international relations were now being dominated by the shogunate in Japan. Of course, the shogunate in Japan eventually fell in the Meiji Restoration to the 1868 when they decided, hey, we're going to have an emperor come back. More specifically, we're going to have a constitutional monarchy because we want to modernize like the rest of Europe. And that led to major changes in Okinawa as a result. They were forcibly absorbed into Japan as originally what was called a domain in 1872. Still technically had kings, but they were now tax-paying parts of Japan. And then in 1872, they officially just became a prefecture. The kings were dethroned. They were no longer independent at all. They were considered part of Japan. And that didn't mean, hey, you're like, full awesome citizens of Japan now. It meant, we're going to make you Japanese. They ended the big time repression of Ryukyuan languages and cultures in favor of Japanese culture. Like this didn't just happen in Okinawa, this happened in other places where people used like non-standard, like local Japanese dialects, but they would, if you were at school and you were caught speaking Okinawan or any of the other Ryukyuan languages, they would hang this around your neck as a sign of shame. It was very much, you're going to be Japanese now, Japanese culture this, Japanese culture that, and that's why all the Ryukyuan languages are dying, basically, at this point. There are a few thousand native speakers of Okinawan left, and it's probably the only one that's got a chance of making it to the next century. it was a lot. Things like karate were okay, but like a lot of elements of their culture they were just not supposed to practice anymore. And then things got really fun in the 20s when there had been a boom in the rice markets during World War I, and then that fell out, and because at this point, like all the economic focus in Japan was on the mainland and not really on Okinawa, they did not give them any proper like support and resources. There was a famine. They call it, it's known as the cycad hell times because the people would go to like the tropical seeds and eat them, and except if you don't prepare the seeds properly and you eat too many of them, they are poisonous. And so it was a pretty awful time. And by this time, about 15% of the population of Okinawa left the island to either Hawaii, usually to Hawaii, just to get away from what was going on there. It was really, really bad. All right. And then World War II happened. So like I said, so Okinawans and the other Ryukyuans were conscripted to fight in the war, just like everybody else in Japan. And in the Battle of Okinawa, about 90% of all the buildings on the island were destroyed, just period. And that included all the historical sites. Shuri Castle was destroyed, the gardens were destroyed. It was all just, this is a picture of a plane flying over. It was leveled. The whole island was leveled. About 150,000 Okinawans died, either in battle or by forced suicide by Japanese soldiers. And I bring this up because, with Oppenheimer coming out and everything, you hear sometimes people trying to defend the dropping of the nuclear bomb by saying, oh, look at Okinawa. All of these Japanese people were ready to die to the last man to defend their homeland. And it's like, no, that was Japanese people using an ethnic minority as cannon fodder. And if you go to the museums in Okinawa where they discuss the war, they talk about that a lot. It was really awful. This was something that was done to them. It was not this joyful, voluntary thing that they did. And they're still really bitter about it. I remember having a conversation with soldiers when I was in the airport once who had been stationed down there and saying it's like, yeah, like they don't like us. They don't like us being stationed down there, but they also really don't like the Japanese government still down there. There's a lot of among the older people who lived through this, a serious resentment of how they were treated during the war. And in the wake of that, Okinawa was occupied by American forces until 1972. It was basically completely under American control during that time period, no democratic elections. And so technically that ended in 1972. Well, this is the American presence in Okinawa today. Those areas, this is the island of Okinawa, those areas in pink are American bases. 75% of the American troops in Japan are in Okinawa. And that's actually, I hate to say this, that's actually better than it used to be. This part here up at the north was much bigger. They gave a huge chunk of it back recently because there is an awareness that, this is kind of a problem. This base in particular, Futenma here, is extremely controversial because it is right downtown in the middle of the city, and they're having planes and helicopters flying in over all the time. So that's one that a lot of people would like to have shut down eventually. And there's just the whole issue that if soldiers leave the base and commit crimes, they don't get tried in Japanese courts, they get tried in American courts. There's a lot of things going on that, But I do think there is, at least among people who know this in America, there is an awareness that, this is a problem. We're creating a lot of animosity towards us with things in Okinawa. Like my cousin who was living on the base was very open talking about that this was not a great situation. And just to make matters worse, so the really cool Shuri Castle that I had the pictures of, the palace there that I visited, it burned down 4 years ago. It was just an accidental fire. There was an electricity and one of the lights went out and it burned down overnight. And the positive thing I can say about this, I mean, like I cried when I woke up in the morning and found out that that had happened overnight, is that they put up like a GoFundMe campaign and they raised like literally millions of dollars in less than a month towards rebuilding it, and they have started rebuilding it. And hopefully it'll take less time than it did. You know, it was destroyed in 1945 and wasn't rebuilt until the 90s. So hopefully it's going to take less time than that. So I don't want to end this on that downer of a note. So when I was there, I said I was with my cousin. I also went there with her kids. We went to Churaumi Aquarium. Now, Churaumi Aquarium, if you remember that word, churasa means beautiful. Churaumi means beautiful ocean. It has the second largest tank after the aquarium in Atlanta, and that's because it's got whale sharks. And that was so cool. I will tell you, they're enormous. You were walking down the hallway, and it's just like they have this line of windows going by, and it's like, oh, you know, I've been at the kind of the normal aquarium part of it, and you're walking on towards the Kuroshio tank, and you're walking by, and like, oh, there's a whale shark swimming by you at your level, and it's, yeah, it's a lot. So, and it's really fun. So that part of it was very, very fun, getting to see some of the animal life from around the Okinawan waters, getting to hang with my cousins. So, yeah, it wasn't all sad and negative, but it was kind of on like an eye-opening part of like a history of the world that I did not know about, and things like that. So, all right, I will take questions now. Actually, let's go back and leave it on the happy pictures for the questions. All right, here we go. All right, yes?
Start off the questions on a depressing note. What was the population of Okinawa before World War II?
Oh, like maybe 500,000.
Okay.
Because like I said, a lot of people had left, so, yes.
Is there any active attempt or to try to maintain the language and expand it at all?
Yes, there actually is. There definitely is, and some of that is being promoted on like a prefectural level by the prefectures are Japanese states, by the way, and so like when you go to like all of these museums had text in both languages there. I actually, when I was getting ready in the morning, my first day, I had like TV on while I was brushing my teeth and everything, and they had like a kids program called Nihongo de Asobo, which is like let's play with Japanese. And for the last 5 minutes of it, it had like a separate segment, and you can actually find these on YouTube, I found out. One where they just stopped that and they cut to a scene in Okinawa, and it was like, oh, Uchinago chide ashibie, or whatever it is in Okinawa. And, you know, from then on, I could not understand any of it. So, like, the final 5 minutes of it was doing that kind of language kids show in Okinawan. So, there is an attempt, a very strong attempt to try to keep the Okinawan language surviving. So, yes.
This is a question. Do you know if any members of the previous royal family of the Ryukyu Islands are like still around, like any members?
I actually don't know that. When I was at the Tamaudon exhibit, and by the way, I would say like the English at Shurijo was really good. The English at the Royal Gardens was there but bad. Everything at Tamaudon was actually in Japanese. There was no English translation. But they had like an article about how the last son of the king was allowed to be buried there in like the 1920s, but I don't know what happened to the family after that, if they're still around. So, all right. Any others?
All right,
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much.